Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third biweekly briefing hosted by Act for Public Health. My name is Wesley Hartman. I use he, they pronouns, and I am a senior attorney at ChangeLab Solutions. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that uses the tools of law and policy to advance health equity. You may have seen we had a last-minute substitution, so I'm incredibly thankful and excited to be joined today by Christy Mallory. Christy, do you want to quickly introduce yourself and your work?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Wesley, and the team. I'm really excited to be here to talk about the work of the Williams Institute. I'm currently the Interim Executive Director and the Legal Director at the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law. We are an interdisciplinary organization that's housed at the law school, but have folks on staff from a range of different backgrounds. I'm a lawyer. We have several other lawyers on the team. But also folks with backgrounds in economics and public health and demographics and psychology and so on. And essentially, we've all come together to produce research on LGBTQ people to ensure that laws and policies that impact LGBTQ communities are based on data and facts and not myths and stereotypes. So excited to be here today. Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful. And thank you all again for joining us for this twice-a-month briefing series that Act for Public Health is hosting to help explain and interpret the impact of recent federal actions on state and local public health practice. So Act for Public Health is a group of organizations and experts applying experience in public health law and policy to help push back against attempts to block public health officials' ability to do their jobs. This partnership includes my organization, ChangeLab Solutions, as well as the Public Health Law Center, the Center for Public Health Law Research, Public Health Law Watch, and the Network for Public Health Law. Our first briefing about 4 weeks ago explored the general effects of a range of federal executive actions on state and local public health practice. And our second briefing 2 weeks ago focused on executive orders and federal actions attacking diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, or DEIA initiatives. So we'd encourage you to go back and look at our materials on those topics or watch the recordings if you weren't able to attend. For today's discussion, we're going to focus more narrowly on executive orders and other federal actions attacking LGBTQ plus communities throughout the federal government, and in some cases seeking to require or encourage attacks on LGBT communities by non-federal actors like state and local governments, nonprofits, and other private sector organizations. So we'll start with a quick overview of some of these executive orders. We'll talk about how federal agencies are seeking to implement them, the impacts we're seeing in the field, and the challenges against them. And then we'll spend the majority of the conversation talking about the broader context of what is happening legally with LGBT communities in the US right now, and discuss strategy about how folks might respond. Last thing before we dive in, I have to note that although Christy and I are lawyers, we are not your lawyers. The information in this briefing is just that, informational, educational purposes. It does not constitute legal advice or representation. For legal advice, you should consult with an attorney in your jurisdiction. So with that, let's get started. Christy, would you mind kicking us off by just summarizing what are some of these executive orders that the federal administration has passed?
Yeah, definitely. So I want to highlight a few orders that specifically kind of target or impact the health of LGBTQ people, given the setting that we're in today. And then I'll just briefly mention some others that also impact LGBTQ rights. And I really want to do that because we know that even if an executive order or action doesn't directly target LGBTQ health, these other orders have an impact on LGBTQ health because they exacerbate already existing health disparities for LGBTQ people by enshrining stigma and discrimination into policy. So with that said, I want to start by just going over some of the basics of these orders. And I'll start with Executive Order 14184. I'm going to give the titles of these executive orders. They are I want to highlight that later. So I'm going to give the official title of it and then kind of talk about what it does. And I just want you to think as I go through that, how the title of the executive order doesn't really match with what is being done in the executive order itself. So the first one is called Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to Federal Government. And what this order does is essentially erases transgender people and non-binary people from recognition by the federal government. And so it starts off by redefining the term sex as it's used across the federal government. And it does that. And so this is in contrast to what had been done in the Biden administration, looking at the term sex to be inclusive of gender identity. So this goes in the other direction and doesn't even just define sex as biological sex as assigned at birth, which we often see, but tries to define sex at the moment of conception. So I just want to point that out because it's unlike any other policy that we've seen in this space, which often rely on sex as assigned at birth or so-called biological sex. But no one's sex is actually designated at the moment of their conceptions. That would be impossible. So I just want to point out that that's the starting point for this executive order. And so from there, it instructs federal agencies to interpret non-discrimination laws to not protect trans and non-binary people from discrimination based on their gender identity. It requires all federal policies and documents to refrain from mentioning transgender people or gender identity. It limits the scope of the Supreme Court's decision in the Bostock case, which you may have heard of, which basically says that sexual orientation and gender identity are discrimination on those bases are forms of sex discrimination. So even though that Supreme Court case stands, the executive order limits its reach by saying that doesn't apply to sex segregated spaces. It also prohibits federal prisons and detention centers from allowing people to be housed consistent with their gender identity. It also prohibits the use of federal funds to support what it calls promoting gender ideology, which is basically a restriction on any federal funding that recognizes trans or non-binary folks. And it rescinds many pieces of supportive guidance issued under the Biden administration. And most of this guidance was issued by federal agencies specifically to protect LGBTQ and more specifically trans and non-binary youth. So that's that first kind of executive order. The other one that I wanted to go into in depth because it really touches on health and well-being is the order that impacts access to gender-affirming care for young people. So this is Executive Order 14190, and its name is Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation. So this order, like I said, restricts access to attempts to, use the federal government's power to restrict access to gender affirming care for young people. It does reach 18-year-olds, so it is an expansion of many policies we see at the state level, which reach minors. This one also includes young adults that are 18 years old. And the order basically comes in and characterizes the research supporting access to gender affirming care as junk science. And it forces the government to go in a different direction here than it had under the Biden administration, to basically disavow the benefits and the impacts on trans youth, the positive impacts on trans youth's health and well-being when they have gender affirming care. Directing HHS to do its own review of research, which it has completed. And unsurprisingly, that research concludes that there are significant risks to accessing gender affirming care and very few benefits. This is in contrast to what has come out from many medical researchers, all major medical associations, many other therapists and providers of mental health for trans youth. So inconsistent with all of that. And basically, the order calls for the revocation of federal funding to medical institutions that provide gender affirming care to youth. And also really takes this broad view that the federal government can reach pretty far into limiting this access to care, even directing the Attorney General to enforce criminal laws about female genital mutilation against providers and parents who facilitate access to care for young people. So those are the two main executive orders that I wanted to highlight today, and just really quickly to run through a few others that you should be aware of. Executive Order 131 or 14183, titled Prioritizing Military Excellence and Readiness, is the new trans military ban. The Executive Order 14190, which applies to schools, is titled Ending Radical Indoctrination in K through 12 Schooling. And this order reaches broader than just to LGBTQ people or LGBTQ rights in schools. It really prohibits schools from engaging in any type of DEI work or supporting marginalized students more generally. In terms specifically of trans and non-binary students, it prohibits schools from affirming their gender identity, either from using the names or pronouns that they want, or from not disclosing to a parent that a student has expressed a gender identity contrary to their birth sex in school. This also operates through federal funding, so attempting to revoke federal funding under Title IX to schools that don't comply with these policies. I will note that the order in its terms explicitly applies to K through 12 schools. K through 12 schools aren't as reliant on federal funding as either colleges or maybe even as you'd think. Just to highlight there that the reach may be more limited than what you might think just reading the executive order's text itself. Then I just kind of wanted to highlight one more quickly, which is Executive Order 14201, titled Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports, which rescinds Biden administration policies protecting LGBTQ youth in schools that receive federal funding more broadly than just K through 12. And requires federally funded schools to limit sports participation and access to shared facilities based, again, on this idea of sex defined at the moment of conception rather than gender identity. So that I just wanted to highlight this and give you a few takeaways here. I know that's a lot of information very quickly. I think we have links to the EOs coming out in the chat so you can look at them. But I just want to note that these orders really are part of a larger pattern of legal and policy action in recent years targeting trans and non-binary folks. In the past, we've seen kind of the federal government implement LGBTQ supportive policies, for instance, and then that can trickle down to the states and they follow along and become more inclusive and pass policies consistent with that. We're seeing the opposite here. This is kind of a trickle up. So we saw this happen in a lot of states. There was a groundswell in more conservative states over the last about 5 years with similar policies that are now being adopted and implemented by the federal government. So that's one point. The next takeaway, again, which I highlighted at the beginning, is just really focusing on the titles of these executive orders, which in and of themselves are not objectionable. I don't think anyone would disagree that we should prohibit genital mutilation of children. But that's not what the order is about. And that goes for all of these. So I just want to note there that the language used is inconsistent with the actual policy goals of the orders. And then my final takeaway, which Wesley's going to get into, is that these executive orders are largely statements of policy and they require implementation. So a lot of these things aren't happening yet, and we're still waiting on agencies to see what they're going to do. Some of them have acted and some of them haven't, but I just want to make sure that just the order being there doesn't mean that entities bound by them have to comply immediately. And I will turn it back to Wesley. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll touch on a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of implementation. So I think, like you mentioned, Christy, like a lot of these attacks really focus specifically on transgender, non-binary, and other gender expansive communities. Um, so like, in response to the, quote unquote, gender ideology executive order, a lot of federal agencies are now restricting identity documents. And that includes passports, social security, and also immigration documents. So over the past several years, people have been able to change the gender marker from, male to female, female to male. There have been X options, so that people can feel affirmed in their identity. And this has a huge impact on health, when you're required to present an ID to someone and they are going to make a decision about how to treat you based on what you have presented. And it is now no longer possible to update or change gender on lots of those documents. The Department of Defense has taken steps to begin enforcing a trans-military ban. The Department of Veteran Affairs is phasing out gender-affirming care for veterans. And outside of, these more focused attacks on gender expansive communities, there have also been, implementation that has affected the broader LGBT community. So federal agencies have, like you said, removed policy documents and guidance that would have been supportive. Federal agencies have removed other materials related to LGBT health, stopped collecting data about transgender identity, and have begun denying and terminating research funding related to LGBT health and HIV. So in terms of public health practice, this is resulting in a loss of jobs, loss of ability to provide programs and services. The loss of data and information is going to make it increasingly difficult to address health disparities for LGBT people. And these federal orders are also resulting in implementation by non-federal organizations, right? So they create this sort of environment that it is more okay to attack or discriminate against LGBT people. So you might see voluntary changes in policy that are more restrictive. I think, like you mentioned, in terms of like the threat of enforcement by the Department of Justice or attorneys general, and particularly the threat of loss or termination of funding, are really causing people to sort of comply and advance with these executive orders, even if they wouldn't necessarily be like legally required to comply with the order. And lots of these orders are also being challenged. So I'll just highlight some of those challenges briefly. The National LGBTQ plus Bar Association has an excellent tracker of all of these lawsuits if you'd like to refer to it in the future. The litigators bringing these actions are major organizations like Lambda Legal, the ACLU, GLAD Law. So they also have a lot of excellent materials. But a few to highlight are GLMA versus NIH, which was very recently filed at the end of May and is challenging the termination of a lot of these LGBT and HIV-related research grants. We also have National Urban League v. Trump and San Francisco AIDS Foundation v. Trump, which are challenging the DEIA executive orders and the gender ideology executive order. And then PFLAG v. Trump, which is challenging the executive order prohibiting gender-affirming care. And that case in particular has been stayed pending outcome in the pending case before the Supreme Court, US v. Skrmetti. So with that, I think I might turn it back over to you, Christy. Could you start off talking about the broader context? What else is happening to LGBT communities in the US besides just these executive orders?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for that segue, Wesley. I think it's really important to spend just a second talking about Skrmetti here. This is the case that's at the Supreme Court, which is a challenge to a state level ban on access to gender affirming care for minors. The case is specifically centered on access to puberty blockers and hormones. Surgery is not included kind of in what's being briefed and won't be decided on. But we don't have, I know time is short this morning, so I don't want to go too deep into the legal arguments there. But I do want to say that this decision is going to have a lot of implications for the current executive order and these other cases, and state laws around gender affirming care. So if the Supreme Court upholds the ban, that is, decides that a ban on access to gender affirming care for youth is not unconstitutional, this will mean that it kind of kicks it back to a state level decision. So gender affirming care won't be banned nationwide for youth, but states that have bans will be able to maintain and enforce those bans. This also means that the federal executive order limiting access to gender affirming care, unless challenged on other grounds, of which there are many and will be brought, the order itself and the policies implementing it won't violate the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, except maybe for those 18-year-olds. There is some indication that youth should be treated differently than adults. We'll see how the decision comes out. But I just wanted to highlight that because the case has broader implications in that the Supreme Court is being asked to consider essentially how closely it's going to review, how closely it's going to scrutinize laws that discriminate against transgender people. If we get a decision on that, it will affect all other cases brought as equal protection challenges. So many of the cases that Wesley just went through raise the same legal issues, and this case may bear on those cases, depending what the outcome is. So again, really the basic takeaway there is the decision in this case will have broader implications for other types of rights outside of gender affirming care. Then I also wanted to just mention that there are these executive orders that Trump is issuing that reach much further than LGBTQ rights, that impact obviously immigrants and access to public benefits, and even data collection and health data. And because LGBTQ people are disproportionately rely on public benefits, including Medicaid, that many LGBTQ people are immigrants, that many LGBTQ people are affected by HIV, we know that these orders also further marginalize them in addition to the orders that directly target their rights. So I just wanted to highlight that LGBTQ people are feeling the impacts of these executive orders from all kinds of different directions now, which of course, as I said before, this stigma and discrimination and exclusion has further impacts on their health and well-being. The final point I want to make really is just kind of around the data collection. The Williams Institute relies on federal data for many of its studies, so data collection and the improvement of data collection, particularly around sexual orientation and gender identity, is kind of core to our mission and our work. And what we're seeing now is the federal government, as part of its goal of really, again, erasing transgender people, is removing questions about sexual orientation, mostly gender identity from federal surveys, occasionally making these moves for sexual orientation too, but mostly focused on removing questions that ask people about their gender identity. So what this means is we will no longer even have access to information about transgender people from the federal government. As you may remember, early in the administration, the government removed all web pages that addressed gender identity at all. They were required by court order to restore those pages and restore the data sets they removed. There is actually a federal law requiring public access and open access to federal data. So they had to restore all of the data sets and all of the web pages. If you look at any kind of federal government web page, if you go to HHS and look up something that has to do with gender identity, you'll see a blurb on there that explicitly states they were forced to put this page back by a court, and they do not believe in gender ideology or promoting gender ideology, and essentially are speaking out against the requirement that they even have to have these pages as part of the administration's website. So expect more on this front too, just complete removal of questions that the Williams Institute and others have worked so hard to have included over the past several decades. I think we've tracked something like 70 or 80 federal government surveys that ask questions about gender identity and sexual orientation, and that's gonna be a huge loss. So just wanted to highlight that that is also going on here.
Yeah, and in terms of public health practice, I'd really underscore these cuts to HIV funding and monitoring the proposed cuts to Medicaid and to SNAP, which are so key for supporting health, especially Medicaid covering HIV and mental health services for LGBT communities. And then the other piece I would mention here is that this intersects with a lot of state and local laws, right? So it's going to vary heavily depending on the context, whether states recognize and protect certain families or family relationships, whether they have non-discrimination laws, shelter laws, or other protections for gender-affirming care, or recognition of trans and non-binary people through state identity documents. So I'll pivot us quickly to, what are some things folks can do? And I want to start with this data piece, right? It's so critical that state, local, and private organizations continue to collect data about LGBT people because we can't address disparities if we don't know what they are. And also there is some risk there, right? The Supreme Court just approved unprecedented access to Social Security data by the US DOJ service. So I think there will be some careful discussions there around like what data do you collect? How is it stored? What other state and local laws exist in your jurisdiction that can help protect misuse of that data, protect that data from misuse? And what are other ways to protect the data through like policy and practice, making sure it's not identifiable or re-identifiable and wouldn't be used against someone. I would also highlight there are plenty of different ways to do advocacy, whether that's weighing in through formal like notice and comment processes as rules and regulations change to implement some of these actions, or whether that's through things like an op-ed or just your regular or organization or entities communications, recognizing LGBT communities. I'm curious, Christy, if there are things you would suggest folks do.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, and I think it's great that you're here listening to this talk, but really just continue to educate yourselves and help to educate others. I mean, one thing that I always ask for from folks who attend my presentations is if you could take one thing you heard today and just tell one other person, that really helps spread this information beyond even the huge group that we're able to reach today. And it's just really important that with so much going on and our attention pulled in so many different directions, we don't lose sight of anything that's happening to our communities and marginalized communities more broadly.
Yeah, I think that person-to-person connection is really key. And would also say, to the extent that you're working in a jurisdiction or in a place where you feel more limited and how you can speak publicly in support of LGBT people, you may also be able to work with and support other partners. So who are your local community organizations that are really supportive of LGBT people? And what else do they need, from public health, or how could they use health data or expertise that you may have to help further their own missions? I'll pause for a second, Christy, if you have any last thought or want to address any of these other questions. Otherwise, I will wrap us up.
Yeah, I just want to take 1 minute to talk about, because I think there's a lot of concern in the chat around kind of the tensions around collecting data about sexual orientation and gender identity and ensuring that it's not used to further discriminate or against or target trans and LGBTQ people more broadly. So at the Williams Institute, we're kind of taking an approach here of both advocating for more and better data collection at all levels of government and in the private sphere. And we're, fighting pretty hard as possible through the courts and legal system to maintain questions on federal government surveys, although I know that's tricky, but we're also pushing at the same time for better privacy protections around data. We are working with Congress and members of several state legislatures to either introduce or bolster protections around data, not just for LGBTQ people, but in general. So we think it's important that those two movements happen in tandem.
Thank you so much again, Christy, and thank you all for joining us. We'll collect questions and answer them after the briefing, and you're also welcome to reach out to ACT for Public Health Partners if you have other questions. We'll continue to have these briefings every 2 weeks on Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you have registered for this session, you're registered to get reminders for all of them. So please stay tuned and you will see a survey pop up at the end.